Cause and effect, the Muckrakers. Causes of the Muckrakers. Gilded Age corruption, political corruption, party bosses, political machines, hands-off government economic policies known as laissez-faire, lack of government regulation, the desire for reform, and progressive magazines and literature. Progressive reform in the early decades of the 20th century depended upon journalism to raise public awareness of serious societal problems. One of the most important investigative journalists is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair went to Chicago with a desire to write about immigrant workers in Chicago's slaughterhouses and meatpacking industries. What he uncovered was horrible working conditions, violence, unsanitary food processing, which shocked Americans. The American consumer was shocked to find out what was happening to their food. Although Upton Sinclair's intent was to make Americans more concerned about the workers inside of these factories. Readers were more interested in what was happening to their food. Upton Sinclair famously said he aimed for the public's heart, but he hit their stomach. Ida Tarbell. The rise of corporate trusts and monopolies in the Gilded Age spurred Congress to legislate regulations on business practices. First such law was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Journalist Ida Tarbell wrote about John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Its shady dealings, ruthless business tactics, which enabled Standard Oil to control 90% of the kerosene market. Ida Tarbell's book, History of Standard Oil, encouraged the government to use the Sherman Antitrust Act against Standard Oil Company. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil to break up because of Ida Tarbell's book. So here we have The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. In the center we have McClure's Magazine. McClure's Magazine was at the forefront of progressivism. At the turn of the 20th century, they published a lot of articles written by muckrakers. And on the right, we have Ida Tarbell's History of Standard Oil Company, which was a culmination of several stories written for McClure's Magazine. Lincoln Steffens. Lincoln Steffens traveled from city to city, interviewing politicians, reformers, crooks, and editors. His articles exposed corruption and explored reform in America's major cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. His stories were published separately in McClure's Magazine, and they were put together as a book called The Shame of the Cities. Steffens revealed in a striking fashion the abundant nature of government corruption and the equally widespread apathy or lack of concern by America's public. Photographers were also muckrakers. Jacob Riis sought to expose the terrible living conditions of Americans in urban cities. So he took pictures of poverty and slums, and he presented it and wrote articles hoping to lead to more awareness and reform movements to improve the living conditions for America's quickly growing cities. Here's some of his famous pictures. And photographer Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine used his camera to document the issues of child labor in America. He worked for the National Child Labor Committee to expose the issues facing child workers. His photographs helped lead to reform and laws changing this practice. So he waited outside of factories, took pictures of children inside factories, working with dangerous machinery. He wants the public to be aware of the dangerous issues of children not going to school and working. Jane Addams. Jane Addams was one of America's most important reformers. She was the leader of something called the Settlement House movement. Settlement houses brought middle-class volunteers together with poor and struggling Americans to help end poverty. Jane Addams' settlement house was called the Hull House, and it was constructed in Chicago to provide social and economic opportunities to those in need. What were the effects of the Muckrakers, these writers and journalists? Well, it led to one of our first truly modern presidents, progressive presidents, to take action. President Theodore Roosevelt was encouraged by the reform movements and Muckrakers to become a trust buster, to break up large, powerful monopolies and trusts. He was encouraged by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle to sign into law the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Meat Inspection Act, which put inspectors inside of slaughterhouses to ensure that the animals that were being processed weren't diseased. There was a push to give citizens more voting power, a lot of voting reforms, initiative, referendum, and recalls. There's an amendment, the 17th Amendment, which enabled American citizens to directly elect U.S. senators. There are child labor laws, mandatory schooling laws, city sanitation improvements, and assistance to immigrants and the unemployed. So the Muckrakers had many positive effects on American society. And that concludes our cause and effect on the Muckrakers.